All right, round one of Axis and Ally Stalingrad complete. The Axis started with pretty significant forces on the west side of the Don, ready to cross into the Don River on August 12th, I believe, 1942. A successful Soviet attack actually crossed the Don itself. The minor Axis infantry there was easily wiped aside, and now the supply lines for the Wehrmacht are wide open for a Soviet tank. So the Axis forces are going to have to find a way to probably turn around and attack, maybe from Serafimovich to Bolshoi. Otherwise, the Germans had some pretty decent success. They're stuck in a pitched battle here, not quite across the Don in Kremenskaya. They did successfully take Ilovinska, and this one next to it across the Don, let's see, Kotluban. And they were pretty successful in clearing out the Soviet forces in the south, maintaining their supply lines on the southern end. Some minor Axis infantry is ready to join in. So you can see pretty much in the area of the Don, except for around this northern bend here, the Germans have broken through pretty well, and the road to Stalingrad is not very well defended. However, their vulnerable supply line has to be addressed. Over in the city, because it's August 1942, Stalin's not one step back order is in effect, so all the Soviet forces in the city could do was move around the city, but they can't leave the city until after round two. Unfortunately for the Soviets, they did lose a fighter, but they did keep a bomber. So right now, I'd say the Axis forces had a pretty good first turn. They broke through where they needed to. Just one kind of big hitch up there in their supply line to the west, definitely threatened. They maintained the entire Luftwaffe at this time. But breaking into Stalingrad and occupying Stalingrad, very different things. We'll see how it goes. All right, turn two is complete. We are now in round three, second half of September 1942. In Stalingrad, we still had to enforce the not one step back rule by Stalin. So again, Soviet forces were not able to leave the city, but they were able to position themselves in the entranceways to hopefully slow or repel the incoming soon-to-be Axis attack into the city. The Soviets also kind of abandoned the idea of reinforcing the actual region around Stalingrad and decided to start purchasing infantry reinforcements to get on the ferries to get into the city, because Soviet leadership is anticipating that the fight's going to become primarily for the city as opposed to the region map here on the next couple turns. So moving over to the region map, in the south, the Axis forces have pretty much wiped away all Soviet resistance, and they're heading towards Stalingrad from the south. They were also able to take the fortified region of Potomac, and we've got armored reinforcements and infantry reinforcements that are going to enter the city here soon. Important rule in this game is when German infantry enters the city, mechanized or regular infantry, they basically double themselves upon crossing in. So one infantry enters, it becomes two. So there's going to be a pretty significant host coming toward the city pretty soon. Minor Axis infantry has the southern flank. They'll probably try to protect against any potential Soviet counteroffensive. Now that it's turn three, the Soviets can prepare and launch Operation Uranus at any time, which is a great historical counteroffensive that will attack, or that attacked at the flanks of the Axis forces around the city when the Axis forces were overextended. So we have one Soviet unit that was able to hold on here in Kalak. They are unsupplied, though. They can't trace supply back to any of their supply zones on the region. So they're likely to be quickly snuffed out here. The Axis forces were able to successfully negate the threat to their supply lines from the flank. And now the only Soviet forces remaining on the region board are some rockets, a couple infantry units, and that artillery. So we should see a large-scale Axis offensive into the city here on the next round or two. And then city fighting, street fighting is going to start, going to get real exciting. Okay, round 3 is complete. It is now the first half of October. The Soviets on the Stalingrad map have, I think, tried to tactically move some units back from the very edges so as not to take the absolute full brunt of the Axis forces that are going to come into the city, and instead to try to better position themselves to not only enter ambush sites from which they can attack all of the city territories that connect them, but also to protect these resource zones, because they don't want the Germans getting more money for the eventual Operation Winter Storm. So they've pulled back from the edges here on the eastern side. In the north, since that's a fortified zone, that's that bunker, they're going to try to stand and fight here as well on the northeastern side of the city. Try to stand and fight while hedging their bets and putting some units in resource point zones. They've also already put an infantry in an ambush site because they're anticipating Spartanovka may fall sooner rather than later. In addition, they've committed to putting new infantry on their ferries to cross them over the Volga River. And they now have 8 rocket launchers that can bombard anywhere in the city. So they're anticipating that it's going to get pretty hot in there. On the region board, all of the Soviet forces have been destroyed, and they've decided to not reinforce the region board, instead focusing on the battle for the city. The Axis could have started throwing units into the city, but they're trying to be patient and instead position all their units so they can all enter pretty much simultaneously and do a 3-axis attack on the northeastern, northern, and southwestern side of the city, all simultaneously, hoping to overwhelm the city's defenders. So the region map is pretty well in hand for the German forces and their allies. Since it was turn 3, the Soviets were able to start drawing reinforcements for the eventual counteroffensive on the region map, Operation Uranus. Got a card up there. They could have launched it, but I think they're thinking, let's see how the battle for the city goes before we launch the counteroffensive that goes around, attempts to go around the flanks of the Axis forces. And also, the longer they wait, the more forces they'll be able to deploy in more places on the region board. So I think it would have been hasty for the Soviets to try and launch a counteroffensive this early, being as the battle for the city has yet to even begin. So we'll see how it goes. Round 4 has just completed. We're now going to start the second half of October 1942. Not much has changed on the region board, just some minor positioning of Axis units to be able to continue to funnel into Stalingrad. Soviets did buy a tank on the region board to further bolster future Operation Uranus operations, and maybe to try to take some supply routes away from the Axis, but they decided against it on this round. Just one unit out there on its lonesome would probably be easily destroyed by Axis air power, which is still at full strength. But things have heated up in the city of Stalingrad. The Germans and their minor allies have entered on the eastern side. They're preparing a major assault into a few resource zones. They were able to successfully enter and take the northern entry, Orlovka. They did attack the northeastern entry, Spartanovka. They did some damage, but the Soviets were able to counterattack and throw them out. However, the Germans do have more reinforcements coming in. And there was a slight slowing in the ferry operation. The Axis powers were able to destroy this ferry and the unit along with it, so they weren't able to get to the grain elevator. But the Soviets bought a new ferry, and replaced it. So, yeah, more big attacks set to happen in Stalingrad. Right now, Operation Uranus still has not launched for the Soviets. They're still biding their time, I think trying to maybe set a trap. But it could be coming up on that time now, depending on how this goes here. All right, round 5 complete. We're now in November 1942. That was a busy round. The Germans made really outstanding headway into Stalingrad in the northwestern and the southwestern sectors. Just a little hold up here, but they were able to cut off the supply of the only Allied forces remaining across the Volga in the White sector. But the Soviets had great success in repelling and dislodging finally that Axis attack in Spartanovka. There are more Axis forces that could move down back in to resume the fight again. However, because of how things were going in the center and the southwest of Stalingrad, the Soviets decided to launch Operation Uranus and had some moderate success in taking out these mixed German and German minor Allied forces right south of Potomnik, which could make them cut off the supply lines of the German forces that are in Stalingrad, potentially. So Operation Uranus launched from the southeast and the northwest. They had great success in taking away these previously German-occupied territories across the Don River, and they're continuing the assault. Now, because the Soviets had to launch Operation Uranus earlier than they would have liked, due to the state of the actual city, they don't have a ton, right? I mean, it may be enough to get behind the supply lines and carve up the German-occupied area behind the Don River. It may not. We will see. And because they launched Operation Uranus, 3 rounds from when they launched it means Operation Winter Storm for the Axis powers can begin. And they'll be able to spend all the money they've been accumulating and do their own, I guess, counter-offensive. So this may be too meager. We will see. But again, because of the state of the city, they had to do something to pull these forces away that were going to continue to funnel into the city and get them out in open battle to the west of Stalingrad. So now bad weather may start to occur. Again, November 1942, very exciting round. Battles in the region west of Stalingrad and battles throughout the city. Let's see how it goes. All right, that was the end of round 7. First half of November, the battle for the city continues. The Axis have continued to grind their way through from the west into the center. They've worked their way up. It's looking pretty good along the Volga. They have attacked Spartanovka again. They have not broken through, but they have a follow-up round coming. I think they might finally be able to dislodge that. But the Soviets have really tried to stake their bets on ambush sites adjacent to Barricade Factory. That's the artillery factory, as well as placing units in there, and it is a fortified area. So Stalingrad's not complete yet. Axis is well on their way, but it's not done yet. On the region board, the Soviets have dislodged the minor Axis forces in Beketovka. They're going to make their way toward, I think this is Potomnik, which is one of the critical supply lines into the city. Meanwhile, armored forces have cut off the supply route out of Rhinoc. So if they can successfully cut off Potomnik, Vertachi, and Rhinoc, then all Axis forces, the 6th Army in Stalingrad, will be cut off from supply. They are very close to being able to do that. We may see. They did have a major breakthrough in the center of the region to the west of the Don. They have taken one of the Axis supply lines there, and they weren't able to dislodge the Axis infantry in the other supply line. So Uranus doesn't have a lot of gas left, but if they can cut this off in time before Operation Winter Storm, they may be able to give themselves just the breathing room they need to survive in the city. However, the next round, round 8, is when Operation Winter Storm comes, and those German reinforcements are going to swiftly follow. So this is quite a heavyweight bout, and it continues. Okay, that was the end of round 7. Heading into December now. We did have bad weather on round 7, so the Don River froze. The next time we have bad weather, the Volga will freeze, and these ferries will become ice bridges. which means more than just infantry and supply tokens can cross them. Any other unit type can now as well across the river from east to west. Because there was bad weather, there was no air unit attacks allowed, except for the Germans did make a supply drop into the city in anticipation of this potentially being cut off. Right, the Soviets have taken Rhinoc, Vertachi, and now all that remains is Potomnik. If they can finish this off, which they're close to, then Stalingrad will be out of supply, and we'll have to use that supply token, but it's a one-time use to try to supply an attack or a defense. So we've got more supply. We're gonna have to slowly get that into the city. The Soviets are spreading out in the deep flank. The Soviet doctrine of deep battle is well and truly alive. They are trying to take all of this lightly unoccupied, formerly German-occupied spaces. But it is round 8, so Operation Winter Storm will finally come in. German reinforcements will enter the board. The only question is it too late? The race to complete the occupation of Stalingrad will come down to the Barricade factory, which continues to be reinforced. And if there's bad weather again, there will be no Luftwaffe air support. If bad weather continues, it only hurts the Axis. This is coming down to the wire. Okay, round 8 is complete. We're at the back half of December. We did not have bad weather in the first half of December, so there were air units flying that greatly helped the Axis forces punch, finally, that very stubborn Soviet group in Spartanovka. Then they assaulted the Barricade factory, took it, but a Soviet counteroffensive wiped all the German forces out, but they died trying to take it too. So it still remains German controlled. There is only one more resource point territory on the city board, and that is the tractor factory. If the Axis can take it and maintain supply into the city, which they currently do not have because the Soviets have every route into the city, then they will have an automatic victory. So the Axis forces need to take the tractor factory. They don't have much to do it with, though. You can see the whole city board is pretty Spartan for both sides. But they do have a significant armored force preparing, assuming they might have some air power if the weather's good, trying to attack Potomnik and reopen that supply line into Stalingrad. So Operation Winter Storm did occur. A lot of the money went to that armored spearhead to try to break through and break into the city, and some went to the southeast just to ensure that the Soviets don't gobble up all those remaining Axis territories and have an auto victory that way. So both boards are pretty sparse. These fighters are real tired. We'll see if we have bad weather again. If we do, the Volga will freeze, and there will be no air forces for either side again. But right now, both sides are weak, and they are trying to find a way to end this. That was the end of round 9. We're going into January 1943. Well, again, there's barely anything on the Stalingrad board. Soviet rocket launchers across the Volga River have been taking out what's barely remaining. The Germans were able to capture Potomnik and reopen supply to Stalingrad. They would have had an automatic victory if not for the sneaky Soviet artillery that was able to sneak in and take one of the resource point territories in the city. Now their total victory conditions are gone, and Potomnik is still contested. Meanwhile, still Operation Uranus forces have attacked Operation Winter Storm counteroffensive forces and are nearly able to destroy all the Axis forces on the region map. This is about as down to the wire as possible. The Soviets can still win if they take all of these remaining Axis forces to the west of the Don, and they maintain control of the 3 territories that go into Stalingrad. But they need to gain control from this one Axis armor first. So we will see. End of round 10, going into round 11, end of January 1943. The Soviet artillery has made it across the frozen bridge. Soviets remain entrenched here. not many forces of any side in Stalingrad. That slug match continues. Operation Uranus continues and has done grave damage to the German supply lines to the west of the Don. And really what this all hinges on, if the Soviets, oops, that should have a German marker, that's still German. If the Soviets can dislodge the Axis armor from Potomac, cut off Stalingrad supply, and capture everything west of the Don, they will win. If the Germans can claw their way back to these last two remaining resource point territories in the city and maintain control of Potomac, they will win. I can't imagine a game any closer than this. There's barely any units left on the board. This has been awesome. That's the end of turn 11. Turn 12, but the Soviets have done it by the end of January. They've maintained their foothold on the resource point territories on the Stalingrad map. In fact, the entirety of the Axis forces are unsupplied, so they couldn't even fight in this battle here, because the Axis was able to take, the Soviets were able to take Potomac with the tank, move it in, guarantee that Stalingrad will be maintained by them, and they were able to, with Operation Uranus, able to wipe out the remainder of the Operation Winter Storm forces that came up from the south and take everything to the west of the Don, thereby securing them at the end of the round a total victory. However, just because it's a total victory, I don't think that quite illustrates just how close this was. This really was. But so the 6th Army is 3 small infantry battalions that are unsupplied and waiting Soviet imprisonment, and the entirety of the original staging area has been recaptured by the Soviets. But this truly was about as close as it could get. So that's it. It's over. Axis and Allies Stalingrad.